In the 1830s, a machine was invented that could do the work of 50 men in a single afternoon. It was faster, cheaper, and more reliable than any crew. It should have spread overnight. Instead, towns banned it. Workers destroyed it. Some states made it illegal to operate within city limits. Not because it was dangerous, not because it didn't work, because it worked too well, and the men it replaced had nowhere else to go. This is not a story about progress. This is a story about what progress costs, and who pays for it. The machine in question had many names depending on where you stood. Farmers called it a miracle. Manufacturers called it the future. But the men whose hands it replaced, the men who had spent their entire lives mastering a craft that suddenly didn't matter, they called it something else entirely. They called it the end. And they weren't wrong. To understand why America tried to ban its own future, you have to understand what life looked like before these machines arrived. You have to feel the weight of a scythe in your hands at 4 in the morning, when the dew is still heavy on the grain and your breath fogs in the air. You have to smell the wheat, that particular sweetness of ripe grain ready for cutting. You have to know what it meant to be a skilled worker in a world where skill still mattered, where your ability to swing a blade at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right speed, for 12 hours straight without faltering, was the difference between your family eating and your family starving. So let's go back. Back before the machines. Back when a man's labor was the only technology that existed. In 1830, the American grain harvest was the single largest collective human effort on the continent. Every summer, millions of acres of wheat, barley, oats, and rye had to be cut by hand. Not next week. Not when it was convenient. Right now. Because grain that sits too long in the field shatters. The kernels fall to the ground and rot. The heads droop, and the seeds scatter to the wind. Farmers called it shelling out. One day, your field was a fortune in golden wheat. The next day, it was worthless stubble, with all the value lying on the ground, rotting into the soil. You had roughly 10 days from the moment wheat ripened to the moment it was worthless. 10 days to harvest an entire year's income. 10 days to justify 12 months of plowing, planting, weeding, and praying for rain. 10 days when everything you had worked for hung in the balance. And the only tools available were the same tools humans had used for 3,000 years. The sickle, the scythe, the cradle. These weren't primitive implements wielded by ignorant peasants. They were highly refined technologies, perfected over centuries of use, representing the accumulated wisdom of 100 generations of farmers. The grain cradle, the most advanced harvesting tool of the era, was a marvel of practical engineering. It consisted of a scythe blade mounted below a wooden frame with long wooden fingers, usually 4 or 5 of them, curving parallel to the blade. When you swung it properly, the blade cut the stalks at the base, while the fingers caught them and laid them in neat rows for binding, one smooth motion repeated thousands of times, turning standing grain into windrows ready for the sheaves. A good man with a grain cradle could cut about 2 acres per day. 2 acres doesn't sound like much until you understand what those 2 acres required. That's working from sunrise to sunset, swinging a blade that weighed 15 pounds thousands upon thousands of times, your arms aching, your shoulders burning, your hands blistered and bleeding through the calluses you'd spent years building, your back screaming from the constant twisting motion, your lungs full of chaff and dust that made every breath a labor. And you had to maintain your rhythm. The cradle doesn't work if you swing it wrong. Too fast, and you tangle the stalks. Too slow, and you miss the timing with the reel. Too high, and you leave valuable grain in the field. Too low, and you dig into the dirt and ruin your blade edge. Every swing required judgment. Every moment required skill. 2 acres of golden wheat, laid flat in windrows, ready for the binding crews to follow. That was a good day's work. That was what a skilled cradler could accomplish when everything went right. Now do the math with me. A modest farm in Pennsylvania or Ohio might have 40 acres of grain. That's 20 man-days of cutting alone. 20 man-days before you even start binding the sheaves, those bundles of cut grain tied with twisted straw that the binding crews assembled. Before you stack the sheaves and shocks to dry, teepee-shaped piles that let air circulate while keeping rain off the grain. before you thresh the kernels from the stalks using wooden flails, before you winnow the chaff from the grain by tossing it in the wind. A single farm required a small army of workers showing up at exactly the right moment. Working at maximum intensity for 2 brutal weeks, hoping all the while that the weather held and the rain stayed away. Miss your window and you lost everything. A summer thunderstorm could flatten a field in minutes, laying the grain flat against the wet earth where it would sprout and rot. 2 days of rain could ruin a harvest where it lay. Every farmer knew stories, passed down through generations, of men who had worked all year only to watch their crop destroyed by weather in the final week before harvest. Men who never recovered. Men who lost their farms, their families, their futures, all because the sky opened at the wrong moment. This created something economists would later call the harvest labor bottleneck. For most of the year, a farm might need 3 or 4 workers. A family could handle it easily. But for 2 weeks in summer, that same farm needed 15 workers, or 20 or 30, strong men who could swing a cradle from dawn to dusk without stopping. Men whose arms wouldn't give out, whose backs wouldn't break, whose spirits wouldn't flag in the brutal August heat when temperatures climbed past 90 degrees and the air hung thick and still over the ripening grain. Where did those extra workers come from? They came from everywhere. Harvest season was a migration unlike anything else in American life. It was the largest temporary labor movement the continent had ever seen. Young men walked hundreds of miles following the ripening grain northward. They started in Virginia in late June when the earliest wheat came ready. They worked their way through Maryland and Pennsylvania as July heated up. They pushed into New York and Ohio as summer reached its peak in August. They followed the harvest like a wave rolling up the coast, arriving at each farm just as the grain turned golden and the farmers grew desperate. These men slept in barns when farmers offered them, in fields when they didn't. They made beds of straw and woke before dawn to begin the day's cutting. They ate whatever the farmers fed them, enormous meals heavy with meat and bread and vegetables because the work demanded thousands of calories just to maintain strength. They worked themselves to the edge of collapse for 2 weeks, collected their wages in cash, and moved on to the next farm north, following the ripening grain until the season ended. Entire families hired themselves out during harvest. Fathers brought their teenage sons. I'm teaching them the craft of the cradle, building the muscles and calluses that would sustain them through decades of harvests to come. Mothers and daughters followed behind the cutting crews, binding the cut grain into sheaves, stacking the sheaves into shocks, working from dawn to dusk, just like the men, because every hand was needed. Workers who had other jobs the rest of the year dropped everything when harvest came. Blacksmiths closed their forges. Carpenters laid down their tools. Shop clerks left their counters. All of them joined the harvest crews because the wages were extraordinary and the need was absolute. A good cradler could earn $1 a day when most men earned 50 cents, plus room and board, plus the chance to drink and celebrate with the other harvest hands when the exhausting work was finally done. This was the economy. This was how it had always worked, and millions of people had built their lives around it. Then Cyrus McCormick showed up with a machine that changed everything. The McCormick Reaper was not the first attempt at mechanical harvesting. Inventors had been trying to build a working reaper for decades. The Romans had experimented with the concept 2,000 years earlier, but every design failed for the same reason. Grain doesn't grow uniformly. Stalks lean in different directions depending on wind and weather. Some stand tall and straight, while others lodge flat against the ground. The terrain is never perfectly level. A machine that worked in a test field inevitably jammed, clogged, or destroyed more grain than it harvested in real conditions. McCormick solved the problem. His design used a reciprocating blade, a straight cutting edge that moved rapidly back and forth like a saw, rather than a spinning blade or a fixed edge. This allowed the blade to cut cleanly, regardless of which direction the stalks happened to lean. Above the blade, a rotating reel with wooden slats gathered the standing grain and pushed it toward the cutting edge. Behind the cutting mechanism, a platform caught the cut grain and held it until a worker could rake it off into piles. A single operator guided the machine while a horse provided the motive power. A second man rode on or behind the machine, raking the cut grain into piles as it accumulated. 2 men and 1 horse could harvest 12 acres per day. 12 acres in a single day with 2 men and 1 horse. The same work that previously required 6 skilled cradlers and working themselves to exhaustion from dawn to dusk could now be done by 2 people who weren't even breaking a sweat. The horse did the hard work of pulling. The men just had to guide the machine and rake the grain. But the implications went far beyond simple labor savings. Because the men being replaced weren't just workers, they were specialists, they were craftsmen. A good cradler was an artist in his field. He could judge the ripeness of grain by its color, by the way it bent in the wind, by the sound it made when stalks rustled against each other. He knew exactly when the kernel had hardened enough to store well through winter, but not so much that it would shatter when the blade struck. He could adjust his swing for wet stalks versus dry, changing his angle and speed to match conditions that varied hour by hour. He could keep his blade at exactly the right height to cut clean without shattering the heads, a judgment call that required constant attention and years of experience to master. This was skill developed over a lifetime. Knowledge passed from father to son, from veteran harvest hand to eager novice, through seasons of practice and years of observation. The reaper didn't care about any of that. It cut grain at one speed, in one way, at one height. It cut wet grain and dry grain the same. It cut tangled grain and standing grain the same. And it cut it all just fine. A skilled cradler could probably do marginally better work on any given stalk. But across 12 acres, the machine's consistency beat the human's artistry every single time. McCormick patented his design in 1834 and began manufacturing reapers for commercial sale. He priced them at around $100 per machine, equivalent to roughly $8,000 in today's money. Expensive, but a farmer could pay off a reaper with a single good harvest. And once he owned one, he would never need to hire a cutting crew again. This is where the trouble started. If you're finding value in this, take a second to subscribe. I cover forgotten history like this every week. Stories about the workers and machines that built America and the costs that nobody remembers. Hit subscribe and you'll never miss one. You might assume that farmers immediately embraced the reaper. Lower labor costs meant higher profits. Simple economics, right? But nothing about this was simple, because farmers existed in communities. They weren't isolated economic actors making purely rational decisions. They were neighbors. They were friends. They went to church together, and those communities included the workers they hired. Think about a small town in Pennsylvania in 1836. Population, maybe 300 people. The local farmers grew wheat. The local young men hired on for harvest every summer, maybe 50 or 60 of them, working 2 weeks at top wages, earning money that sustained them through the rest of the year. Those young men spent their harvest earnings at the general store, buying supplies and small luxuries they couldn't otherwise afford. They spent at the blacksmith, getting tools repaired. They spent at the tavern, drinking and celebrating after the brutal work was done. That money circulated through the entire community. The storekeeper counted on it. The blacksmith counted on it. Everyone was connected. When a farmer bought a reaper, he wasn't just eliminating jobs on his own property, he was removing money from the local economy. His neighbors felt it. The young men who suddenly had nowhere to go during harvest, they felt it most of all. And they responded the way desperate people have always responded, with anger, with action, with violence against the machines that threatened their livelihoods. The first documented case of reaper destruction in America occurred in Virginia in 1837, just 3 years after McCormick received his patent. A group of seasonal workers snuck onto a farmer's property in the darkness of night. They came with sledgehammers and iron bars, and they smashed the machine. They didn't just damage it, they reduced it to scrap metal. They bent the blade until it snapped. They shattered the wooden frame into splinters, where they broke every component that could be broken. Then they piled what remained and set it on fire, making sure nothing could be salvaged. The farmer tried to press charges. An investigation was open, but finding witnesses proved impossible. Everyone in the community had seen something that night. Strange figures moving in the darkness, sounds of metal striking metal, the orange glow of fire from the equipment shed. But no one would testify. No one would name names. The case was dropped for lack of evidence. This wasn't simple crime. This was community enforcement of social norms. The message was clear: buy a reaper and this is what happens. Choose the machine over your neighbors and your neighbors will respond. And it happened again and again and again. Throughout the late 1830s and 1840s, reapers were sabotaged across the Northeast and Midwest. Workers jammed rocks into gears, bending teeth and cracking housings. They cut the leather drive belts that transmitted power from the wheels to the blade. They loosened bolts so the machines would shake themselves apart in the field. Some attacks were surgical, a single critical component removed in the night, impossible to replace without ordering a new part from the manufacturer hundreds of miles away. The machine would sit useless for weeks while the farmer waited, watching his grain ripen and shatter in the field. Other attacks were theatrical. One group in Indiana stole an entire reaper from a farmer's barn. They disassembled it completely, piece by piece, and threw the parts into a river. They made sure witnesses saw them doing it. And they wanted everyone to know what happened to machines that threatened their livelihoods. But destruction alone wasn't enough, because for every machine destroyed, 2 more were sold somewhere else. The economics were simply too compelling. So the workers tried something else. They tried to make the machines illegal. This is where the story gets strange. Because in a handful of American towns and counties, they actually succeeded. Local governments had broad authority to regulate what were called nuisances. In the 1840s, some communities attempted to classify labor-saving agricultural machinery as a public nuisance. The argument went like this: when a machine displaces workers, those workers become unemployed. Unemployed workers require public assistance. Therefore, machines that cause unemployment create a public burden. And public burdens can be regulated. In 1841, the town of Herkimer in upstate New York passed an ordinance requiring any farmer who used mechanical harvesting equipment to pay a license fee of $5 per day of operation. The stated purpose was to fund poor relief for workers displaced by machinery. But the actual purpose was obvious. $5 per day was enormous. It was designed to make reapers economically unviable. Consider the math. Hiring a traditional cutting crew cost about $60 for the harvest season. The reaper eliminated most of that expense, but the license fee was $50 for 10 days of operation. Add in the cost of the machine itself, and suddenly the reaper's advantage disappeared completely. Similar ordinances appeared in scattered townships across New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. None used the word banned. They imposed licensing requirements, operational restrictions, noise regulations. They just happened to make mechanical harvesters impractical to operate. And for a brief moment, in a handful of places, these restrictions worked. The machines stopped coming, the traditional harvest crews kept their jobs, but it only worked in small communities with the political will to enforce such rules, because larger forces were moving in the opposite direction. If you're learning something from this, hit subscribe. The forgotten workers of American history deserve to be remembered. The 1840s saw a fundamental shift in American agriculture. As settlers pushed westward, they encountered something the East Coast had never seen: endless flat land, prairies stretching to the horizon without a single tree, a single rock, a single obstacle, land perfect for mechanical harvesting. In the East, farms were small and irregular, bounded by forests and streams. A reaper might save labor, but the savings were limited by geography. On the prairie, there were no obstacles. A farmer could claim 160 acres and plant every inch in wheat. But harvesting that much grain by hand was impossible. The population density was too low. You couldn't hire enough workers because there weren't enough workers to hire. The reaper wasn't just convenient on the prairie, it was necessary. Without mechanical harvesting, large-scale prairie agriculture couldn't exist, and so the machine that communities had tried to ban in the East became essential in the West. McCormick moved manufacturing to Chicago in 1847. He sold over 1,000 reapers in 1850. By 1856, over 4,000 annually. By 1860, over 80,000 reapers operated on American farms. The battle was over. The machine had won. The workers who had fought the machine didn't disappear. They migrated. Some went west themselves, hoping to become farmers rather than laborers. Others moved to cities where factory jobs absorbed surplus labor. Still others simply aged out. The 45-year-old cradler who had spent his life following the harvest found himself with no job and no prospects, too old to learn new trades, too proud to accept charity. These men faded into the margins, dying poor and forgotten. The seasonal migration ended. The harvest crews disbanded. The communal ritual of bringing in the grain, the shared labor that had bound communities for generations, disappeared in a single decade. And nobody built monuments to what was lost. But the reaper was just the beginning. The threshing machine followed within a decade. Traditional threshing required workers to beat grain with wooden flails in enclosed barns full of dust that coated your lungs. A skilled thresher processed about 8 bushels per day. The mechanical thresher processed hundreds. One machine replaced an entire crew. Then came the mechanical seeder, the cultivator, the binder. Each innovation eliminated another category of labor. By 1880, a single farmer with equipment could grow and harvest what previously required 20 workers. The pattern was clear. The machine always came. Workers always resisted. The resistance always failed. And the workers were always forgotten. This wasn't unique to America. The same struggle had played out in England decades earlier, in a more violent and concentrated form. The Luddite movement of 1811 through 1816 saw English textile workers systematically destroying the power looms and stocking frames that threatened their traditional crafts. And examining what happened in England helps illuminate what happened, more quietly, but just as completely, in the American countryside. The Luddites were not a mob. They weren't ignorant rioters smashing things they didn't understand. They were organized. They operated at night in groups of dozens or hundreds, with military discipline and clear chains of command. They had scouts who identified targets and planned approaches. They had leaders who coordinated attacks across multiple towns simultaneously. They had signals and passwords and safe houses where operatives could hide after actions. When they struck hard and fast. They broke into factories with sledgehammers and axes, smashing every machine they could reach, then disappeared into the night before authorities could respond. The British government treated them as an existential threat to social order. At one point, more British soldiers were deployed against Luddite bands in the industrial north of England than were fighting Napoleon in the Peninsular War. Parliament passed the Frame-Breaking Act of 1812, making machine destruction a capital offense punishable by death. Military tribunals tried captured Luddites under emergency powers. Dozens were hanged. Hundreds more were transported to Australia, a punishment that was often worse than execution, separating men forever from their families and condemning them to brutal convict labor on the other side of the world. The movement was crushed by overwhelming state violence. The machines won. English textile production soared, while the skilled hand weavers who had opposed the machines either adapted to factory work or perished in poverty. But here's what most people don't understand about the Luddites, what most historical accounts get wrong. The Luddites weren't irrational. They weren't afraid of technology because they didn't understand it. They understood it perfectly. That's precisely why they were afraid. They understood that a power loom operated by a single unskilled worker could produce in 1 hour what a skilled hand weaver working at his craft produced in an entire day. They understood that factory owners would choose machines over men every single time the economics allowed. Not because factory owners hated workers, but because machines were simply better at the job and cheaper to operate over time. They understood that their skills, developed over lifetimes, refined through years of apprenticeship, passed down through generations of craftsmen, would become worthless within a decade or two. They understood that they were watching their own extinction, and they were right about all of it. The American workers who smashed reapers and sabotaged threshers shared the same logic, the same terrible clarity about what was coming. They weren't ignorant peasants afraid of newfangled contraptions. They were skilled craftsmen who could see exactly, precisely what awaited them. They knew that once the machine proved itself reliable, once farmers saw how much labor it saved and how much money it made, there would be no stopping it. They knew that their lives and their children's lives would never be the same again. And they fought anyway, because what else could they do? Walk peacefully into oblivion? Accept without resistance that everything they knew, everything they had worked to master, everything they had planned to teach their sons and daughters would be swept away by gears and belts and iron wheels? The answer, history tells us, is yes. That's exactly what they eventually had to do. That's exactly what happened. But let's not pretend it was easy. Let's not pretend they were foolish for fighting. They were trying to hold on to something real, a way of life, a community of shared labor and mutual dependence, a sense that their work mattered, that their skills had value, that they weren't interchangeable parts to be discarded when a better mechanism came along. They lost that fight. They always lose that fight. We always lose that fight. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing these stories. The ones about the workers who built America and were forgotten. The ones about the machines that replaced them. I tell them every week because someone has to remember. Now I want to talk about what all of this means. Not just for the 1840s, but for right now, today, in this moment when you're watching. Because the story I've been telling isn't really about Cyrus McCormick and grain cradles and steam-powered threshers. It's about a pattern that repeats whenever a new technology threatens existing livelihoods. And that pattern is repeating right now in ways that should sound very, very familiar. Think about what happened in the 19th century. A new technology emerged that could do familiar work faster and cheaper than human beings. Workers recognized the threat immediately and resisted with every means available to them. They tried destruction, they tried regulation, they tried to ban the machines outright through licensing requirements and legal restrictions and political pressure. All of it failed. The machines were simply too efficient. The economic pressure was too strong. Eventually, resistance collapsed, and the old way of doing things disappeared completely. Now think about the last 50 years of American economic history. Manufacturing workers fighting robots and automation on assembly lines. Taxi drivers fighting ride-sharing apps and algorithms. Retail workers fighting self-checkout kiosks and online shopping. Journalists fighting the internet and aggregator websites. Coal miners fighting natural gas and renewable energy. Truckers watching autonomous vehicles in development. Every single time, the same pattern. Resistance, denial, attempts at regulation, eventual defeat. The workers are never wrong about the threat. They see it coming clearly. They understand what it means for their lives and their families. They're wrong only about their ability to stop it. Because here's the thing about labor-saving technology that nobody wants to talk about. The benefits are diffuse and the costs are concentrated. When the reaper replaced harvest workers, food got slightly cheaper for everyone. That's a benefit spread across millions of people, pennies per person, barely noticeable in any individual household budget. But the cost fell entirely on a few thousand workers who lost their livelihoods completely. Their whole lives destroyed, their whole futures erased, their whole communities hollowed out. Diffuse benefits don't organize. Millions of people paying slightly less for bread don't form advocacy groups. They don't show up at town council meetings. They don't write letters to Congress. They just enjoy their cheaper bread and never think about where it came from or who paid the real cost. Concentrated losses absolutely organize. The workers who saw their futures disappearing fought with everything they had. They formed groups. They coordinated attacks. They pressured politicians and demanded protective laws. But they were fighting against an opponent who didn't have a face, didn't have an address, didn't have anyone you could reason with or threaten or bargain with. They were fighting against mathematics itself, and mathematics always wins. The question was never whether the machines would replace the workers. That outcome was inevitable from the moment the first reaper proved it could do the work of 10 men reliably and efficiently. The real question was what would happen to the workers after the machines won. And the honest answer is that society never really figured that out. We still haven't figured it out, almost 200 years later. When entire industries die and millions of workers are displaced, we have no good mechanism for transitioning them to new productive work. We tell them to retrain, to relocate, to adapt to whatever the economy needs next. We act as if people are infinitely flexible, incapable of becoming whatever version of themselves will be valuable tomorrow. But people aren't infinitely flexible. A 50-year-old steelworker can't become a software engineer, no matter how many government training programs you offer him. A rural farmer can't become an urban professional overnight. Skills developed and honed over decades become worthless in a matter of years. And no amount of job training makes up for a lifetime of experience in something that no longer matters to anyone willing to pay for it. The 19th century harvest workers who lost their jobs to the reaper didn't transition smoothly into factory work. Some did, yes. The young ones, the flexible ones, the ones without families or deep roots in their communities. But many didn't. Many couldn't. They aged out, died poor, until became burdens on their families and communities. Their children might have done better, growing up in a world where the machines already existed, but the workers themselves, the ones who lived through the transition, bore costs that no one ever compensated and no one ever acknowledged. And we're doing the same thing now. We're watching automation and artificial intelligence eliminate millions of jobs across every sector of the economy, talking vaguely about retraining and education and adaptation and hoping somehow it will all work out in the end, just like they hoped in the 1830s. Just like they hoped in every generation since when the machines came for another category of human work. The machines don't hate us, they don't want to hurt us, they just don't need us. And an economy that doesn't need your labor has no place for you. That's not ideology, that's just how it works. The men who smashed reapers understood this at a gut level, even if they couldn't articulate it in economic theory. They felt it in their bones. They knew that the machine's arrival meant their obsolescence. They knew that no one would care about them once they couldn't work. And they were willing to break the law to face jail or worse, rather than accept that fate quietly and obediently. We call them primitive. We say they stood in the way of progress. But at least they fought. At least they didn't go gentle into that good night of obsolescence. By the 20th century, mechanical harvesting was universal. No one remembered a time before reapers. The harvest crews existed only in old photographs. The communal labor was gone. Productivity soared. Food prices fell. This was the triumph. But progress doesn't issue refunds. The workers who paid for that triumph never got compensated, never got monuments, never got remembered. Drive through rural America today, you'll see monuments to pioneers, museums celebrating agricultural machinery. What you won't see is any acknowledgement of the workers those machines displaced. No statue to the harvest hand, no memorial to the threshing crew, no recognition anywhere that progress always runs on human fuel, that someone had to lose for the winners to win. We erased them from memory because their story was inconvenient. Their story complicated the neat narrative of inevitable progress. Their story reminded us that efficiency has costs, that productivity has casualties, that every triumph of technology leaves bodies in its wake. We didn't want to think about that. So we didn't. And now we're doing it again. We're automating millions of jobs and telling ourselves the same comfortable lies. That the market will adjust, that new jobs will appear to replace the old ones, that workers just need to adapt, to be flexible, to embrace lifelong learning, to become whatever the economy needs them to be. Maybe some of that will be true. Maybe not. But whatever happens, let's at least be honest about what we're doing. Let's not pretend that technological change is painless just because the pain falls on people we don't see. Let's not celebrate efficiency without acknowledging its costs. Let's not tell ourselves that progress is free when the bill is paid by workers who have no choice but to pay it. The machine America tried to ban worked exactly as advertised. It harvested grain faster and cheaper than any human crew. It made food abundant and affordable. It helped build the most productive agricultural system the world has ever seen. It fed a nation and helped feed a world. And it destroyed lives in the process. Both things are true. They're both true at the same time. The machine was a miracle. The machine was a catastrophe. It depends entirely on who you were and where you stood when the reaper rolled into the field. The farmers who bought reapers prospered. Their children inherited larger farms with better equipment. Their grandchildren went to college on agricultural wealth. The workers who lost their jobs to reapers did not prosper. They struggled. They suffered. They died poor and were forgotten. The consumers who benefited from cheaper food never knew the names of the men whose labor became worthless. Never thought about the harvest hands who could no longer find work. Never considered that their lower grocery bills were subsidized by someone else's ruin. That's not ancient history. That's the template. That's what's happening right now with every new automation, every new algorithm, every new artificial intelligence that learns to do human work without requiring human workers. The men who smashed reapers weren't villains. They were workers trying to survive in a world that had suddenly decided it didn't need them anymore. They fought for their families, they fought for their communities, they fought for their way of life. They lost because they were always going to lose. But they weren't wrong to fight. They weren't foolish to resist. They were human beings refusing to go quietly into obsolescence. The machine always wins. That's the first lesson of this story. The second lesson is harder. It's that winning isn't enough. It's not enough to be more efficient, more productive, more profitable, because efficiency measures only what we choose to count, and we always choose not to count the people who fall away. The 19th century didn't count the harvest hands. They weren't in the productivity statistics or the GDP calculations or the economic reports that celebrated American agricultural expansion. They were just gone, their absence making everything work better. Their suffering never measured because suffering isn't a line item in any ledger. We do the same thing now. We measure job creation and forget to subtract job destruction. We celebrate the new industries and ignore the old ones dying. We talk about aggregate growth and pretend that aggregates include everyone, but they don't. They never have. The people at the bottom, the workers whose skills became obsolete, the communities that withered when the economy moved on, they're not in the numbers. They're in the silences, the gaps between the statistics where human lives used to be. This video is about machines that were banned because they work too well, but it's really about what we're willing to sacrifice for progress. It's about whether efficiency justifies anything, or whether some costs are too high no matter what we gain. I don't have clean answers. Nobody does. The machines are better at what they do than we are. That's just true. And an economy built on human labor can't survive indefinitely when machines can do the labor cheaper. That's true too. But maybe the question isn't whether to stop the machines. History has answered that question definitively. You can't stop them. They always win. Maybe the question is what we owe to the people they replace. What we owe to the workers who built our prosperity and got swept aside when they were no longer needed. What we owe to the communities that died so that the economy could grow. What we owe to the human beings whose only crime was being less efficient than metal and gears and silicon and code. The 19th century's answer was nothing. The workers lost their jobs, and that was their problem. Society owed them nothing. No retraining, no assistance, no acknowledgement. They were just supposed to figure it out or disappear. Many of them disappeared. We can choose differently. We can build systems that catch the people who fall. We can recognize that technological progress creates losers as well as winners, and that the losers deserve better than abandonment. We can decide that efficiency isn't the only value worth serving, that communities matter, that human dignity matters, that people aren't disposable just because their skills have become obsolete. Or we can keep doing what we've always done. Let the machines win, let the workers lose, tell ourselves comfortable stories about how it all works out in the end. But it doesn't all work out. Not for everyone, not for the harvest hands who watched their life's work become worthless overnight. Not for the factory workers automated out of jobs they thought would last forever. Not for the millions of workers right now watching computers and robots and artificial intelligences learn to do what they spent decades mastering. The machine America banned because it worked too well is still winning. Still replacing human labor with mechanical efficiency. Still driving costs down and productivity up. Still leaving people behind without looking back. The only question is whether we'll remember them this time. Whether we'll see the workers in the statistics and recognize them as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. Whether we'll learn anything at all from the 200 years since the first reaper rolled into an American wheat field and changed everything. If you made it this far, you care about history that matters. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling these stories every week. the forgotten workers. The machines that replace them, the costs of progress that nobody wants to talk about. Because if we don't tell these stories, they disappear. Just like the workers themselves, just like everyone who ever lost a fight against a more efficient future, the machine won. The machine always wins. But that doesn't mean we have to forget the people who lost. They swung their cradles from dawn to dusk. They fed a nation with their hands. They built an agricultural system that fed the world. And when the machines came, they fought. They lost. We forgot them. Let's not forget again.